Hey, Internet. This is your WatchCats weekly news roundup for Friday, June 20th, 2025. I'm Julian Sanchez, back at last with beloved co-host Noah Cunin.
Great to be back, Julian.
So our lead story today, there is a really thorough and lengthy New York Times investigative report headlined "The Bureaucrat and the Billionaire Inside Doge's Chaotic Takeover of Social Security." There's a really thorough and thoroughly sourced look at Doge's tenure within the Social Security Administration and how the career staff there reacted and were often essentially steamrolled by Doge, which in many cases did not really understand how the agency functioned or what the data that they were looking at signified. And some of these specific stories will be things that we've discussed before and that you may have heard about, but in all cases, there is new detail. This is a very long and, again, thoroughly reported at piece that I won't try to kind of summarize in full, but just to hit sort of some of the highlights there. They document how internally Social Security staff tried to correct some of the bogus claims that Doge and Elon Musk were perpetuating about massive fraud and tens or hundreds of millions of dead people collecting Social Security benefits. Apparently, internal staff understood right away that that was wrong, that the Doge folks had misunderstood what they were seeing in the databases and attempted to correct it. A tidbit I had not seen before is essentially they got a call from the White House and were told, no, Donald Trump believes Doge on this, so you are not to contradict him. The Social Security Administration and the staff who understand how everything works should not correct the false information that Doge is putting out. In fact, so little were the career staff trusted that essentially their analysis was brushed aside, and a 21-year-old Palantir intern was essentially put in charge of doing their own independent analysis. And they insisted again over the objections of career staff that he be granted access to huge troves of sensitive personal data, even though, of course, he had no experience or training in how to interpret and secure that data. And it also hits on, again, with more details, a story we've covered before about how Elon Musk effectively misunderstood internal reporting about fraud. Internal reporting had said, well, of the relatively small proportion of fraudulent claims that are made, 40% of those people who were trying to submit fraudulent claims did so by the telephone. Doge apparently misunderstood this to mean 40% of the people calling to make changes over the telephone were fraudulent, which is, of course, not the same thing. And this is what led to the now reversed fraud countermeasures that didn't really catch any fraud, but had the effect of slowing to a crawl the agency's actual ability to service people who were trying to call in for help. A second story I think is worth highlighting here is in Politico, a headline "Set Up for Failure." And this is based on, again, a lot of interviews with staff at an array of federal agencies, most prominently the Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who say that Doge-mandated staff cuts and spending freezes have basically rendered those agencies incapable of carrying out some of their basic functions. And this is, again, I think a theme we've touched on in the past, which is it is very easy up front to save money. I can save money by I'm paying insurance on a car, I'm paying for gas. If I want to show up front, hey, look at all the money I'm saving, I can get rid of my car. I can stop paying my power bill. I can, stop paying for a lot of things. And if all you care about is making number go down, you can show what look like impressive cuts. The problem is you may not be able to do the basic functions that your life requires from you anymore if you are prioritizing cutting outlays without a very serious effort to figure out whether those outlays are necessary. And that's what we're hearing, or at least what Politico is hearing from folks at FEMA, EPA, the National Institutes of Health, and a number of other agencies that because, for example, travel spending has been frozen, they're not able to conduct oversight of their own laboratories. They're not able to approve the continuation of projects that are underway and that are kind of half completed, but without approval can't continue, aren't able to do a whole host of the kind of things we expect those agencies to do, including, ironically, some things that are critical to the Trump agenda. So, for example, at EPA, there are various deregulatory moves that and reforms that the Trump administration wants to implement. But the trouble is, those are likely to be challenged in court. So, if EPA is unable to do science, which is one of the things they said, essentially, science there has ground to a halt, well, they're not going to have the documentation and the data that is going to be necessary to justify those reforms in court. So they've essentially set themselves up to be unable to defend against the predictable challenges to the administration's own agenda. That would be an interesting irony. What have you got for us, Noah?
Well, first off, on that part, I just wanted to summarize that to say that this is also just the perfect way the administration can effectively stop agencies from functioning in an end run around the courts or Congress, right? Because of these agencies are complicated machines, throwing a wrench in a critical gear can effectively stop the agency from functioning, even if the courts are ruling against you, even if Congress is pushing you in a different direction. It's definitely an important story to continue to track. And we actually have some resources at the end of this episode that are allowing people to help understand this at a systemic level. But before we get to that story, I want to bring something up from NPR. I've also seen some reporting on this back in February from the Daily Beast, in fact. This is a story around how DOGE engineers at the National Labor Relations Board have been putting some pretty disturbing code up on GitHub. This story from NPR, top House Democrat asks Microsoft, the owner of GitHub, about Doge code allegedly tied to NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, data removal. Specifically, Representative Lynch from Massachusetts, ranking member on the House Oversight Committee, asked Microsoft, as the CEO specifically, to share information about this Doge staffer's account after it had been made private. Before it was made private, one of the reasons why this overarching concern had become such a serious issue is the National Labor Relations Board. Their case management system is called NextGen, but like the letters NXGEN. Case management of cases between unions and their employers, kind of important stuff. And this Doge engineer, Jordan Wick, on GitHub, which is a site where you can put code up if you're an engineer and share code with other engineers and other open source communities, called one of the repositories of code he was working on that was committed to his personal GitHub, not the government's GitHub, whether private or public, not Department of Labor's GitHub, not the NLRB's GitHub, right? Nobody who should actually have this information, his personal GitHub account. The code was called NextGen BDOR Extract. BDOR for backdoor. This is just like saying to the cops, giving your name as John, I'm going to do a crime. When I signed up for this gig, Julian, I sort of had in my mind, a tight conspiracy of sophisticated code and policy that would effectuate the Doge plan that we would have to untangle over the weeks and months. But thankfully, because in some sense of the word, thankfully, Doge staff have made this extremely obvious. To wit, Wick, in this case, as soon as it was noted, he had called this code that, made his repository private instead of public, kind of just drawing more attention to it, which is why now the government is asking GitHub to re-reveal that code to them so they can determine what it has, in fact, been doing. There have, in fact, been whistleblowers, one Daniel Barrios and some additional reporting from NPR, that found that 10 gigabytes of data left the agency's case management system. So there's a fair amount of indication that it is very possible this code was used.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you missed the news roundup in which we discussed that, this is a story you can also find at NPR about this NLRB whistleblower that alleges some pretty disturbing conduct on the part of Doge staff to circumvent controls on sensitive data. So we will definitely be continuing to track the adventures of Johnny Do Crimes in future episodes. A couple quick hits here. We mentioned, I think, in the past, a lot of states, in particular, Republican-controlled states, have launched their own little sort of mini imitation knockoff Doges. Lawmakers in Florida passed a last-minute addition to a budget bill that would grant the Florida mini Doge the power to fine cities and counties up to $1,000 a day if they fail to grant that team access to their staff and databases and buildings and other facilities. There's, concern about this, I think, because now the federal version of Doge is largely viewed as having created an enormous amount of chaos and not really had particularly impressive returns to show for it, because it remains to be seen whether at the state level the sort of knockoff versions will have a better track record. And second, not terribly surprisingly here, District Judge James Boasberg, whose name you may recognize for ruling against the Trump administration in a number of high-profile immigration and deportation cases, has pushed back and refused a bid by the Project of Government Oversight to issue a preliminary injunction that would require Doge to preserve records. This is, frankly, a ruling that seems on the law pretty correct to me. Not a judge, of course, or a lawyer, but he noted preliminary injunction is an extraordinary remedy. Under the law, Doge is, even if they're only under the Presidential Records Act, this is part of the controversy over their status, whether they are a real federal agency or not. They're saying, well, we're subject to the Presidential Records Act. Boasberg notes, well, there are record retention requirements under that law. And, Pogo saying, well, but we're afraid those records will be destroyed, is, in Boasberg's view, too speculative to justify an extraordinary court order, that you would need some reason to actually have to present evidence that that's happening, that the law is not being followed and records are being destroyed before it's a court's place to intervene. And finally, Noah, you mentioned a handy new resource by actually a former colleague of yours. What can you tell us about that?
So this is website dogetrack.info. That's dogetrack, all one word, .info. This is a site by Jacob Harris, a former collaborator of mine at 18F. And one of the things about the current, at least for the time being, slowdown in new Doge activities is allowing us to start to get a handle on everything that has already been impacted, and in often cases, the delayed reaction that the public will see in the destruction or interference with these systems, with these agencies. So what DogeTrack is trying to do is trying to put into structured data every human being who has either participated in Doge or enabled it, every agency that has been impacted, all of the events Doge caused within those agency, and then the specific systems that were impacted or created in those agencies as a result of those actions. So it's just formalizing the entire blast radius of Doge and what might be coming next and what the consequences thereof might be as a result. This site is still in beta, but it already has an incredible amount of information. This is by and large a labor of love of one individual, Jacob Harris, who's also still technically doing a full-time job at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So he's doing it free on his personal time. There's no way to support him. He just wants people to know about it or to use it or to suggest improvements. The website itself has both open code and open design. So you head on over there to dogetrack.info and you're a developer or designer and you want to help out or just help collect information or fill in the blanks in areas where Jacob has missed something, head on over.
Thanks. Great. That is our news roundup for Friday, June 20th. Swing back next week. We had a little technical difficulty delay, but our full WatchCats proper episode will be coming next week with development economist William Easterly, where we're going to talk about the Doge-struction of the foreign aid agency USAID. Hope you will enjoy that, and you will join us next week. See you around.